Hi, today we're going to talk about transformations of trig functions. So what that means is we're going to be taking our sine and our cosine graphs and we're going to be shifting them up, down, right, and left. So the first thing that we're going to look at is shifting sine or cosine graphs up or down. So here we have our original y equals sine x. And what we're going to do is we're going to shift it up 3. That's what this plus 3 means at the end. It means that we're shifting it up 3. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw in our new midline. And this right here tells us what our midline is. So my midline is now at y equals 3. And then everything else is going to stay the same. So it's a sine graph. So sine starts at the midline. Then at the first critical value, it goes up to the top. Then at the next critical value, it goes back to the midline. Then at the next critical value, it goes down. So just keeping in mind, if we're at the midline and the amplitude is 1, the number in front of the sine, that means that we're going to either go up 1 from the midline or down 1 from the midline. And then back to the midline. So let's go the other way. So here I am at the midline. At the next critical value, I need to go down to the lowest. Well, the lowest is just 1 below the midline. So that's going to be here. Back to the midline, 1 above the midline, and then back to the midline. Okay. I'm not going to do all of these. Let's take a look at y equals cosine x minus 3. So the minus 3 means that my new midline is now at negative 3. So here's my new midline. And now let's draw a cosine. So cosine starts at the highest. Well, let's think about this. If this is our midline and our amplitude is 1, that means we're going to go up to, is that negative 2? And down to negative 4. So cosine is going to start at the highest point, then go to the midline, then the lowest point, then the midline, then back to the highest. Kind of looks like a U. Okay, then let's do this again. So now we're at the highest, midline, lowest, midline, highest. All right, something I just want to take a look at is shifting trig equations right or left. It's a little trickier. It doesn't come up as much, but when we have something inside the parentheses, that means it's a shift right or left. So this here, minus pi over 2, it's going to be opposite of what you expect in the parentheses. So I have a shift right of pi over 2. That means everything's going to stay exactly the same, except I'm shifting my whole graph right, pi over 2. That means I'm going to start at this line I just made instead of starting at 0. In other words, I'm taking this original sine graph, so I'm going to trace over this just so you can see something. And what I'm going to do is if I don't think I can do that. Oh, yes, I can. I'm going to move it to the right 2. To the right pi over 2, I mean. So here is my original. And now I'm going to take this graph and I'm going to move it. Actually, let's put a dot here so we know that's where we started. I'm going to move it to the right pi over 2. So I'm going to leave that there. This is what my new graph should look like. The same exact graph, just shifted to the right, pi over 2. Okay, so sine, we know, starts at the midline. So I'm going to start it here instead of starting it at 0, 0, because I have to shift it to the right, pi over 2. Then at the next critical value, I'm going to go up to the highest, then back to the midline, then back to the lowest. And then let's work the other way. So if you notice, it looks like when I did the purple one, I moved it to the right, pi over 2, and that's what this new one looks like. Okay, let's try one more. Let's do cosine plus pi, this one down here. So this means I'm going to take my cosine graph and I'm going to shift it to the left pi. Left because it's a plus. When we're dealing with things inside the parentheses, it's opposite of what we would expect. So again, just as kind of a visual, if I take a look at, here's my original cosine. I want to take this graph and I want to shift it left pi. It's going to be shifted. It's going to look like that. Same exact graph, just shifted to the left pi units. Okay. So that means I'm going to be starting here. All right. So let's do our graph. Cosine does not start at the midline, right? Maybe I should highlight the midline for you. Here's my midline. Cosine does not start at the midline. Cosine starts at the highest. So cosine's going to start here, then go to the midline, then go to the lowest, then the midline, then the highest, then the midline, then the lowest. And then let's just work backwards. We're at the highest, so we got to go to midline, and then the lowest. Okay. Like I said, it's a good idea to have an idea of shifting right or left. But usually when we're talking about shifting, it's mostly we shift up and down. So let's take a look at a few practice questions. So this says, in physics class, Eva noticed the pattern shown on the accompanying diagram on an oscilloscope. The question's actually missing, but it says, which of the following is the correct equation? So what always helps me is I always find the midline. Sometimes it's super easy to identify, and sometimes it's not. So you can see the midline here is y equals 1. But if you weren't sure, here's how you can find the midline. Take the highest y plus the lowest y and divide by 2. We're taking the average. So the highest y is 2, the lowest y is 0, and divide that by 2. That gives me 1. That tells me where my midline is. My midline is at 1. Okay, so that doesn't really help though, because notice they all have a plus 1 at the end. Okay, and they all say sine, so that's not helpful either. Let's figure out the amplitude. The amplitude goes from the midline to the highest, so from 1 to 2. How many units is that? From 1 to 2. It's only 1 unit, so the amplitude is 1. So it's got to be either choice 1 or choice 2. Okay, now the last thing is the frequency. How many cycles I see from 0 to 2 pi? Well, let's take a look from 0 to 2 pi. I see half a cycle. So I'm going to pick choice 1. Okay, let's look at the next one. Okay, so here they just want us to write the equations. Okay, so let's find the midline. Again, if it's easy to see, you can just mark it in, but if it's not, let's do our trick. Highest y plus lowest y divided by 2. So my midline is at 1. So I'm going to draw that in. Okay, I'm going to ask myself, is it sine or is it cosine? I know it's sine because it starts at the midline. The amplitude goes from the midline to the highest or the midline to the lowest. So from 1 to 3 is an amplitude of 2. Okay. Now, how many cycles do I see of sine from 0 to 2 pi? Here's 1. Here's 2. So I see 2 cycles. And then I just have to remember that I shifted it up 1. There's my answer. Let's take a look at this one. Let's find the midline first. So highest y plus lowest y divided by 2. So 0 is the highest y, plus negative 4 is the lowest y, divided by 2. So that's negative 2 divided by 2. I'm sorry, it's negative 4 divided by 2, which is negative 2. So my midline is at -2. Okay. So I ask myself, is it sine or is it cosine? Well, it's cosine because it doesn't start at the midline. If it was sine, it would start at the midline. It would start where that orange dot is, but it's not. It's starting not at the midline, which means it's cosine. Okay. It's a negative cosine because it starts below the midline. That's how I know. And the amplitude is 2, from the midline to the highest or the midline to the lowest. So the amplitude is 2. We need a negative in front because we're starting down below. We know it's a cosine. Okay, how many cycles do I see from 0 to 2 pi? Well, here's 0 to 2 pi. One full cycle is this blue. So I'm seeing half a cycle. And then don't forget that -2 at the end because we shifted it down too. Okay. Given the parent function, p of x equals cosine x, which phrase best describes the transformation used to obtain the graph of g of x equals cosine x plus a minus b, if a and b are positive constants? Why don't you see what you think the answer is, pause the video, and then come back and I'll give you the answer. Okay, so it is choice 4 because inside the parentheses is right or left, but opposite of what you expect. So plus a would mean left a, and then minus b is what you expect, up or down, so down b. Says which sinusoid, just keep in mind a sinusoid is a sine or cosine graph, just a fancy word. It's a sine or a cosine graph. Which sinusoid has the greatest amplitude? Okay, so we need to figure out the amplitude of all of these. So the amplitude of number 2 is 3. The amplitude of number 4 is 5. Remember, amplitude is always positive. So even though it says -5, the amplitude is 5. Let's find the amplitude of the choice 1 and choice 3. So I'm going to zoom in a little. Okay. So I want the highest y, so that's 7. I want the lowest y, that's 3. And I want to divide that by 2. So I get 5. Okay, so that's my midline, y equals 5. From 5 to 7, or 5 to 3, is an amplitude of 2. So this amplitude is 2. And then let's find this amplitude. Highest is 3. Lowest is -5. Get -1. So here is my midline. -1, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So the amplitude here is 4. I got that by, I just counted 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So which sinusoid has the greatest amplitude? That would be choice 4. Bye for today.